Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Since it's been a little over a week now since I've seen any of you, since the governor announced that all schools were going back on remote. Uh, Thought I'd get on here and make a video about the Chapter 3 notes, talk through those really quickly. I'm going to try to make it as short as possible, but I am going to try to cover the entire chapter here in this one video. Couple of announcements. Make sure that you are doing the assignments that post each week with our work schedule on Mondays. Uh, you've got music analysis, which will be taking the place of our music quizzes for every student now, since we're not here in person. Can't really do the music quizzes over remote. So the music analysis, which I give you 6 songs, you just pick 3 of those 6, listen to them. I've already got the playlist posted with the classroom resources. Just pick out 3 of those 6 songs, listen to them, and tell me what you think about the 3 songs that you picked. You also need to make sure that you're keeping up with the This Week in Rock. Should be an easy 20-point assignment, but if you don't do them, I'm going to have to put a 0 in, after enough time passes. For those of you that are on remote, or those of you that I might not have seen after the governor made his announcement, we are not going to have a final exam in class before Christmas break. What we're going to do is, instead of having a final exam that covers all the chapters that we've done since the beginning of school, I'm just going to finish this chapter, chapter 3 about the Beatles. We'll take a test on it, and that will close out the 9 weeks and close out the fall semester for us. But if you have any questions, anything like that, now the chapter 3 test, I intend on it being December 16th, December 17th when it unlocks. I will make an announcement ahead of time as to when I plan on unlocking it, but it will be in the last couple of days of the semester. You've got to get the test taken. I'm not going to leave it open all through Christmas break. You've got to get it taken. I'm going to be busy with my daughter having surgery. It's just not feasible for me. The semester ends on December 18th. It's very important that you get the test taken, by the last day of the semester. But with all that being said, if you have any questions, you have any concerns, like always, feel free to email me, post a comment to me in the Google Classroom, and, we'll address whatever the issue is. But now I do want to, if I can get my notes to pull up here. We are going to talk about the Beatles today. And some people with this chapter, some love it because they love the Beatles. Other people, it seems like there's no in between, where it's kind of like, the Beatles are okay. What I run into is students either love the Beatles or they just cannot stand the Beatles. One thing about the Beatles is, the band is almost, they only stayed together for 8 years, but in that short period of time, they created music that people all over the world identified with, and people can still identify with now, almost 60 years later. 50 to 60 years later. So, their songwriting abilities were, very easily identifiable. Something that people could identify with, the type of songs that they made. But then again, sometimes the music just isn't for everybody. But hopefully, as we go through the chapter, you go through the playlist, hopefully you'll find at least a couple of songs that you like, even if you don't consider yourself a Beatles fan. Now, a few quick things here about the Beatles, just to give you an idea of how influential this band was. Now, I've talked about Elvis, in the previous chapter, and how influential he was. Well, as crazy as people went over Elvis, it was even bigger, when it came to the Beatles, in terms of people's reaction. You've got the situation where I talked about Elvis getting mobbed. Well, it was like that for the Beatles everywhere they went. In chapter 2, when I talked about Elvis and his comeback special in 1968, honestly, the Beatles were the biggest reason that Elvis decided to do the comeback special. The reason that he thought his fans were forgetting him is because the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all these other British rock and roll bands were all you were hearing on the radio. And his songs were slipping farther and farther down the charts when he released new music. That is a testament that Elvis could keep making his music without jumping on a sound bandwagon, but rock and roll had changed, and everybody was imitating the Beatles after the Beatles come along and make it make it big in England, make it big in the United States, 1962, 1963, and from that point forward. Now, like I said before, in the grand scheme of things, when we're talking about groups like the Rolling Stones that really just formed a year or two behind the Beatles, the Rolling Stones are still recording and touring to this day. The Beatles, on the other hand, with the final lineup, which they did have a couple of members that came and went before the band really took off, but they really only recorded, John, Paul, George, and Ringo for a relatively short period of time. The band dissolved in 1970, so they were only together for 8 years. But they set so many records in that time span, again, 50 to 60 years ago, records that still haven't been broken. As big as the music industry has gotten, in terms of potential listeners for new artists, the Beatles did so many things that to this day, records, and who knows, the records might never be broken. The Beatles are considered the best-selling group of all time, best-selling performer or group of all time. Official sales records are one thing, then the estimated records in terms of, you have to take into account there. Now we're talking about physical media, going from albums to 8-tracks to cassettes to CDs to digital music. On top of that, you also have to factor in bootlegs, copies that were made illegally and distributed, sold, downloaded for free. The Beatles are considered the best-selling group of all time. It's estimated that there are well over 1.2 billion records, tapes, CDs sold. Digital downloads are going to add probably hundreds of millions to that figure. Just to give you an idea, Elvis is probably the closest, and they estimate him, bootlegs included, to be just over a billion. And so that's 20% beyond what Elvis has been able to produce in terms of sales, not just during his lifetime, but in the 40-some years since he passed away. Now, most multi-platinum albums of any artist or musical group just in the United States. And that's the thing is, the Beatles had a worldwide following. Elvis played 2 concerts outside of the United States. The Beatles did go on world tours. They were known all over the globe, and their records charted. There were some countries that weren't open to that much foreign music, and a Beatles album might stay on the charts in some cases for years in those countries. So again, I might mention some stuff about the UK in these notes, the United Kingdom, but most of the figures and stuff that I give you will be from the United States. Most multi-platinum, meaning that they sold at least double platinum, which is at least 1 million copies, 13 albums just in the United States that were certified multi-platinum. They have the most #1 singles, Uh, 22 number one singles just in the United States. If you took together the records of number one ranking songs the Beatles released all over the world, where they actually track this sort of data, 181 number one songs. Not, and we're not even talking about songs that stayed number one for multiple weeks. I'm just talking about 181 number ones. If you take a number, any single of theirs that reaches number one in any country that records this data, that really, when you look at especially the scope of the music industry today, that is ridiculous to have 181. Now, granted, you're going to have some songs that might have been number one in 17, 20 different countries, but 181 number one ranking songs in countries all over the world over the past, we'll just say, 55 years. Now, couple of specific dates where big records occurred. April 4th, 1965, the top five, all five songs in the Billboard 100 or Billboard Hot 100 were all by the Beatles. Number one, number two, number three, number four, number five, all songs by the Beatles. The following week, April 11th, the Beatles set a record that, again, to this day hasn't been beaten. They had 14 total spots on the top 100. So 14% of the Billboard Hot 100, the top played singles in the country the week of April 11th, 1965, 14 of those songs belong to the Beatles. Something like that has, never even come close to approaching one artist or group having 14 songs on the Hot 100 at one time. Also, something that very few artists have ever been able to accomplish, the Beatles ended up having back-to-back-to-back number one songs 3 different times in the 8 years that the band recorded together, meaning that they release one single and it might be number one for 5 weeks, 6 weeks. They release another single, it goes to number one and it bumps the previous song to number two. It stays number one for a month. Then they release a third single and it goes straight to number one and it bumps those other 2 songs down a spot or 2. It stays at number one for multiple weeks. That one I'd have to go back and check on, but I don't think any other artist has ever accomplished that. The Beatles did it 3 times. Now, in terms of their influences, they don't have a lot of direct influence by the blues, which is something that heavily influenced a lot of British bands. We'll talk about that after Christmas when we get into chapter 4. I'll talk about the British invasion after the Beatles. A lot of British bands in the 1960s, they were heavily in, like the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones start off as a blues band. The Yardbirds start off as a blues band. And as time goes on, it's blues that's heavily influenced by rock and roll. Now, where a lot of British bands were more directly influenced by American blues, with the Beatles, John and Paul specifically were more heavily influenced by American rock from the 1950s. Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, Roy Orbison. I'll talk about down here, skip a bullet or 2. John Lennon named specifically Buddy Holly, Roy Orbison, Bob Dylan as major influences of his. And a big thing about that is that, Bob Dylan was a major recording artist at the same time that the Beatles became the biggest band in the world. So that just shows that it's not just people that came before them. The Beatles were listening to other people's music that were out there at the same time that the Beatles were recording. George Harrison, he named in different interviews his guitar playing style, which is, unlike people. The thing about George Harrison is he wasn't as flashy a guitar player as, say, Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton, but he's still considered on a lot of lists, one of the top 10 guitar players in rock and roll history. But a lot of his influences came from 50s rock, rock or country. Carl Perkins, Scotty Moore, who was Elvis Presley's lead guitarist, Dwayne Eddy, uh, you know, plus he took a lot away from, again, other guitar players that were big while the Beatles were together. Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, but he stayed away from the heavy distortion that Clapton and Hendrix might use. George Harrison's guitar usually had a very clean sound, and he also took a lot of influences from non-Western musical tradition, especially as he starts to explore Eastern philosophy, Eastern religion, Hinduism. A lot of his later work shows an interest not just in Indian culture, but also being influenced by musical instruments, musical sounds that are coming from the Indian culture as well. The Everly Brothers, the Beach Boys, who predate the Beatles by a couple of years, the focus on harmony, that's obviously a very big influence on the Beatles sound, because that's the thing about the Beatles. It wasn't that one person was a lead singer. Basically, they split things up, and whoever wrote the song or whoever did the most writing on the song, because that's another thing, is multiple members of the band. There wasn't just one songwriter. They were all songwriters to an extent. And what would happen is they would usually, John Lennon and Paul McCartney usually did most of the writing. Whoever the primary songwriter was, that is who would do the lead vocals. So if John does most of the writing on a song, that means that he is going to do the lead vocals on that song. If Paul does the majority of the writing, he's going to do the lead vocals. Ringo didn't really write a lot because, and this is something that other Beatles said in interviews, is that when Ringo would write songs, he tended to inadvertently be influenced by stuff that he had heard on the radio. When he starts to put the music together, when he starts writing lyrics, it would sound like another song that a band had on the radio at the time. So they didn't let him do, the Beatles only recorded one song that Ringo wrote. And of course, he did lead vocals on it. And that was on the last album that they recorded together as a group, Abbey Road, which I'll talk about later in the chapter. But usually what would happen is John or Paul would write one song per album. Ringo would do the lead vocals, and John Lennon, you might find out as we go through the chapter, I'm not a huge John Lennon fan myself, but John Lennon, from interviews I've heard, seen, footage of people interviewing him, he could be, he would slip jabs in there every once in a while at some of his bandmates. It might have been a joke, but sometimes it sounded, like an insult. But he said that Ringo was limited in his vocal range, so he had to carefully write a song to make sure that it fit Ringo's singing style. Another thing is that they said, somebody asked one time, and I think this might have been to Paul McCartney, they said, do you think that Ringo's the best drummer in the world? And he said, Ringo's not even the best drummer in the band. So, Ringo, I feel like, while he's not my favorite member of the band, Ringo, I do feel like, didn't really get recognized as a musician, because every other member of the Beatles, all four members of the Beatles, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a band. And then from the late 80s on, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, then George Harrison all get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as solo artists by 2001. Ringo has only been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the last few years as a solo artist. And the odd thing about that is that Ringo has released more solo albums. He's had a bigger solo career in terms of producing music than any of the other members in the band. Of course, John Lennon and George Harrison passed away. In John Lennon's case, John Lennon was shot 40 years ago. George Harrison's been dead for 20 years. So Ringo never really got the attention he deserved. In the theme of the band, he was always kind of like the comic relief. Now, quick look at each of the members of the band individually, and then I'll start talking about how the band came together and, through their time as the Beatles. John Lennon ended up being shot and dying right after, we're talking 2 months after his 40th birthday in 1980. The band that would become the Beatles. John Lennon started the Quarrymen in March of 1957. He ended up meeting Paul McCartney during their second concert, they were playing at like a local festival, kind of like here in Hardinsburg, Hoedown Days. It really was something that small sort of thing. It was just a local neighborhood festival. Paul McCartney was 15 years old, I believe. He lived there, and he just happened to, watch this band play. He really liked their music. Then he caught the lead singer. After their show was over, they started talking. They became friends, and eventually Paul McCartney joined the band. I'll get into that later. Eventually, Paul McCartney brings George Harrison to John Lennon, which there were several years difference in terms of their age. George Harrison was the youngest member in the Beatles. And especially when you're talking about high school age students, say John Lennon is a senior. Well, George Harrison was in 8th grade going into 9th grade. And emotionally, socially, there is a big difference between an 18-year-old and a 14-year-old. Now, when you're 40 and 36, there's not that much difference. 4 years doesn't make that much difference. But when you're younger, there's a big difference between 18-year-olds and 14-year-olds. So it took a while before Lennon was willing to really listen to Harrison play, because the way he looked at it, he was a senior in high school, then he's a freshman in college, and he doesn't want a kid in his band. But when he finally did listen to George Harrison play the guitar, he was the best guitarist he'd ever heard. So he's like, you're still young, but yeah, you can go ahead and be in the band. Again, John Lennon, very accomplished performer in his own right. All the Beatles were, they had big solo careers. And until John Lennon died on December 8th, 1980, everybody, for 10 years after the band broke up, everybody hoped, well, maybe the Beatles would get back together next year. But of course, when John Lennon was murdered, that was the end of that. In a BBC poll back in 2002, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, listed him as the number 8 greatest Briton in that nation's history. He ranked 38th on Rolling Stone's 50 greatest artists. The Beatles were number 1. Rolling Stone also ranked him as the 5th greatest singer of all time, and he was elected into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1994. Paul McCartney was born June 18th, 1942. He's still alive and kicking today. He joined the Quarrymen at the age of 16 in 1957, like I said, after he and John Lennon ended up meeting and becoming friends after that music festival. The most commercially successful ex-Beatle, I mean that he made the most money after leaving the Beatles as a solo artist or with other bands that he started. The biggest band that he started after the Beatles was Wings, but as a songwriter, as a performer, he is the most commercially successful. He's made the most money. One of England's wealthiest men, as of This is several years old, but last time I checked, he was valued at $1.2 billion. And that was after getting divorced from his last wife. And she basically got half of the money that he had at the time. So, he would have been probably around worth 2.5 billion before his divorce. Listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most successful songwriter in the world. Songs that he has written. Now, of course, this is performing as a Beatle, performing as a solo artist, as a songwriter. If it's Yesterday by the Beatles, if someone else records Yesterday and it ends up going gold, he still gets credit for that because he was a songwriter. 60 gold discs, which means that, songs that he's written or performed have gone gold 60 different times. 100 million singles sold around the world. Yesterday is the most covered song in modern musical history. There are, recorded versions 3,500 different times has Yesterday been covered since the Beatles released it back in the 60s. He's the only person in British history to have a #1 song as a soloist, as part of a duet, a trio, a quartet, a quintet, or a sextet. So by himself, in a group of 2, group of 3, 4, 5, or a group of 6. In 1997, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, so he is Sir Paul McCartney. And 1999, 5 years after John Lennon, he gets inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. George Harrison, born February 24th, 1943. He died November 29th, 2001. He ended up becoming friends with Paul McCartney at the Liverpool Institute, which I believe would have been the middle school that they attended back in the 1950s. He was a little bit younger than Paul McCartney, several years younger than John Lennon. He ends up joining the Quarrymen the following year, 1958, at the age of 15. Again, John Lennon looked at him like he was too young then, but he couldn't deny how good of a guitar player that Harrison was. Like I said, most of the lead vocals and songwriting were done by Paul McCartney and John Lennon. George Harrison, he would write songs, and he was a very accomplished solo artist in his own right after the Beatles broke up. Some of the Beatles' most well-known later songs, from like 1966 to 1970, Harrison ended up writing. They start to give Harrison a little more of a role in terms of choice of what ended up getting on the record. Usually, if there were 10 songs on an album, usually John would write 4, Paul would write 4, maybe George would write 1, do the lead vocals on that, and then John or Paul would write a song for Ringo, and Ringo would sing lead vocals on the 10th song. But as the band grows, as the band matures, George Harrison gets to the point where maybe he has 3 songs that he writes and does the lead vocals for. But Taxman, Here Comes the Sun, Something, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, all some of the Beatles' best known songs off of some of their later albums. Had a very successful solo career, both commercially and critically. He didn't become a billionaire like Paul McCartney did, but still he did very well for himself. And in a lot of cases, his albums were more critically praised than Paul McCartney's. So Paul McCartney's solo work, a lot of times critics might end up talking about how it wasn't as good because it was too mainstream. Well, George Harrison, he was liked by fans, he was liked by critics as well. Probably the first modern musician to organize, his own major charity concert. He's ranked 21st in Rolling Stone's 100 Greatest Guitarists of All Time. my personal opinion, he should probably be a little bit higher than that. I'm not saying he's on par with Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton, but he's pretty daggone good. Uh, George Harrison in 1999, the same year that Paul McCartney gets inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. George Harrison, obviously the Beatles had a huge following around the world, for decades, and John Lennon paid the price for that. He was murdered by Mark David Chapman. George Lennon, uh, and the reason that John Lennon was shot was Chapman ended up blaming Lennon for the Beatles breaking up. I don't know if it was because this crazed fan blamed Harrison for the breakup, but he had been stalked, and in 1999, a crazed fan ended up assaulting him, stabbed him, punctured his lung. It took him a while to recover from that. In 2001, he died, and this is something where some people, I've already dealt with some questions from a couple of students. He had lung cancer, but anybody that has dealt with cancer in their family before, cancers, it can be liver cancer, or it could be lung cancer, and you can have tumors develop in other parts of the body. 2001, he died due to a brain tumor, but it all started from the liver cancer that he had dealt with prior to his death. 2004, he ends up getting inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist in his own right. Ringo, Richard Starkey was his actual name, or is his actual name. He was born July 7th, 1940. He was known for his personality. He was like the comic relief of the band. Before he joined the Beatles, he was the drummer for a group called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. He met the guys in the Beatles while both bands were playing at clubs in Germany. And they started to become friends, and eventually the guys in the Beatles were like, we like you. They liked his style, they liked his personality. They had become, not musically, they had just become friends with the guy. And the drummer that they had at the time, which again, I'll get into that in a couple of later slides, they didn't really like the drummer that they had, so they had to make sure that Ringo was on board, and then they fired their drummer and then bring Ringo in as the new Beatles drummer. He ends up joining the Beatles in 1962. Generally, he got to sing, like I said before, one song per album. The only song that he ever wrote and recorded with the Beatles was a song called Octopus's Garden on the Abbey Road album that they recorded in 1969. He never wrote many songs, like I said, because he had a problem with unintentionally copying songs that he had heard somewhere, whether it was on the radio or going to a club or something like that, hearing another band play. But he did, have input with songs and their lyrics in a lot of cases. Now, after the Beatles, just like Elvis, the Beatles made movies. They were not very good at all. If we were having class here in person, I would at least try to play parts of some of the movies that the Beatles made, because they were really bad. It was the same cases with Elvis movies. Production companies were making movies with the Beatles. They were obviously not actors, and they look like movies that were thrown together in a very short period of time. It's just movie companies were getting the Beatles to make these movies because they knew that people were going to pay money hand over fist to see John, Paul, George, and Ringo on the screen. Ringo ended up having a modest movie career, acting. After the band broke up, he played parts in several different movies. He was the voice of the conductor on Shining Time Station, which here in America, you might know as Thomas the Train. And then, he was the conductor on Shining Time Station for a period of time, and then American versions, they bring in other, as Thomas really takes off in the United States. Ringo was the voice of Mr. Conductor, the narrator for a while, and then I think it was the comedian George Carlin, and then I think Alec Baldwin ended up doing the voice for the conductor and the narrator of Thomas the Train and Friends. Also, Ringo ended up playing himself on The Simpsons in an episode or two. He was the last Beatle inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist in 2015. Now, I've already said a lot of stuff here about the Quarrymen already that's listed here on this slide. Just to give you an idea when the two met, John Lennon and his band, the Quarrymen, made up of, some of his high school classmates there in Liverpool. They played a show on July 6, 1957. That's when he ended up meeting Paul McCartney. And, 2 weeks later, Paul McCartney's in the band. Again, they were looking for a lead guitarist, and because the guitarist that they had, he wasn't the best in the world, but also he decided eventually over the course of the next couple of months that he was going to have to quit the band, get a job, work full time. So February 1958, Paul introduces George Harrison to John Lennon. It takes several months. It takes about 6 months before John Lennon ends up agreeing to let Harrison join the band again because of his age difference. At first, Paul brings this kid in and he's like, you got to listen to George play. He's a great guitarist. And John Lennon wouldn't even listen to him just because, John Lennon by this point is, 18, 19 years old. And Paul brings in this, 14, 15-year-old. And, John wouldn't even listen to him. Finally, they are so hard up for a guitarist in August of 1958. He agrees to listen to Harrison play. He tries out. And the next day, John Lennon calls him up and asks him to join the band. So now you have John, Paul, and George. And the Quarrymen aren't going to last much longer because, again, John put the band together made up of people that he was in, that were classmates of his in high school. And they had moved on into the college age or post-high school. Some people had to get jobs. Some people went to college. So the band kind of dissolves in 1959. They weren't getting gigs because they weren't practicing on a regular basis. When they did practice, part of the band couldn't show up because they had to work or they had class, something like that. So John, Paul, and George, they keep playing together, but there really isn't a band at the time. The Quarrymen disband. John, Paul, and George continue on as Johnny and the Moondogs, which was a callback to, the Moondog from that I talked about in chapter 2 with Alan Freed, the Moondog Coronation Ball, the performer that had composed the theme song for Alan Freed's radio show and the Moondog Symphony. And, that's where that name came from. But John and George played guitar. Paul played the drums. Paul McCartney, all the Beatles, they could play multiple instruments. So you see here in Johnny and the Moondogs, John and George are both playing the guitar, and Paul McCartney, who was the bassist for the Beatles, he's playing the drums, and they didn't have a bass player. January 1960, John invited one of his college friends, Stuart Sutcliffe, into the band to play bass. Sutcliffe had no idea he had never played the bass before, but he had one. He had an electric bass. They needed a bass player, so John invited him into the band, and he's like, look, I don't know. It's like, look, hey, we'll teach you how to play it. Sutcliffe really only joined the band because he wanted to get girls. He knew that guys in band got the attention of girls, so he agreed to be in the band even though he didn't know how to play the bass. They tried to teach him to play, and it didn't go very well. So in a lot of cases, what they would do in their pre-show setup, they would either turn the volume down on his amp really low, or in some cases, they might just unplug his bass altogether as the show got started, so people didn't hear the bass messing up the flow of the song. And they start going by the name Long John and the Silver Beatles. Eventually, it's going to become the Beatles, Beat, as in beat in the music. August of 1960, Pete Best joins as a drummer. Paul switches to rhythm guitar. So now the Beatles have John, George, Paul all playing the guitar. Stewart is playing the bass. Pete playing the drums. The band makes its first trip to Hamburg, Germany, because before they could get gigs in London, they had to make a name for themselves. Well, because it was so competitive on the music scene in 1960 in London, a lot of times you'd have to go somewhere else, develop a reputation, get some experience being on stage under your belt, then come back to London. And when for example, a lot of English bands were going to Hamburg, Germany, and they would play like 5-6 months at a time, maybe even longer than that, playing in these bars, playing in these clubs, in the party district of Hamburg, because there were some clubs that were owned by British owners. So they play in these clubs, they develop a reputation. The English guy that owns this band, this club in Hamburg, he knows people that own clubs in London, and he says, hey, if you ever hear from this band, you ought to sign them to, play some shows. It'll get your clubs packed. So they play their first 30-week set, or 30 set. They were playing 30 set weeks. So playing multiple shows a day, sometimes in different bars and clubs. Sometimes they were just the house band that, they might play 4 sets throughout the course of the day, for weeks at a time. This goes on for a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, and then all of a sudden, as authorities, as they would do, come in and they start looking at paperwork, George Harrison ends up getting deported back to England because he was underage. At this point, he was still 17. He hadn't turned 18 yet, so it was illegal for him to travel without a guardian. None of the guys in the band qualify as a parent or guardian. So he ends up getting deported for being underage, having their lead guitarist deported. The rest of the band end up leaving within a few days of Harrison, because they had been working illegally. They didn't have they didn't have workers' permits. As a foreigner going to another country, you have to apply for a workers' permit to be able to work in that country. It's no different than the argument people might make against illegal aliens coming into the United States and working. So Harrison gets deported for being underage. The rest of the band has to leave within the next week because it's discovered that they were working without permits. April of 1961, the band ends up returning to Germany. Of course, by this point, George has turned 18. They get their workers' permits, so everything is legal. As they finished their stint in summer of 1961, Stuart Sutcliffe leaves the group. He decides to stay in Hamburg because he had fallen in love. Because of this and the fact that the whole purpose for him being in the band was to attract girls. He falls in love, meets the girl of his dreams. They get engaged, and since he doesn't need the bass guitar anymore, he just gives it to the band. They're not big by any point or by any means at this point. They are still struggling. Paul would end up switching to bass after Sutcliffe leaves the band. Unfortunately for him, Stuart Sutcliffe would end up developing cancer and dying from that cancer. It was a very aggressive form of cancer. Ends up dying from cancer less than a year after he leaves the band. I don't even think that he and his fiance managed to get married by that point. If you look at the cursor here, this is Pete Best. Then you've got George, that's John, that's Paul, and then that's Stewart, the cool guy with the sunglasses on. before he left the band. And of course, down here, this is the lineup that everybody knows: John, George, Paul, and Ringo. July of 1961, they end up returning to Liverpool. They end up being discovered in November of 1961 by Brian Epstein at the Cavern Club, which was a pretty hot club in London at this point in time. Epstein, who had been managing a record store at this point, ends up convincing them to sign with him as their manager. He changes their image from the Fonzie-looking group up here to essentially, I mean, you all have seen the poster in the back corner of my classroom. They were a boy band in 1962, 1963, but that's going to sell a whole lot better than, this image and this picture up here. May 1962, they end up signing with EMI Records, to a contract with George Martin as their producer. It's not long after this that Pete Best is asked to leave the group because of his attitude, I guess you would say. August of 1962, Ringo ends up officially leaving Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and he joins the Beatles, and the band is off. I'm going to stop here for a minute and start a new video just so these don't end up getting to be too long here. I will come right back on in just a minute.